comments so far. You talked a little bit about the consequences of Russiagate. I want to touch on that as it pertains to foreign policy and matters of war and peace, which we almost primarily deal with. Um, it seems that this narrative of Donald Trump being an agent of Vladimir Putin, Putin's puppet, seems to have masked some serious policies that have increased tension between Russia and the United States. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the effects of the Russiagate narrative uh, on either Trump making policy or the lack of comment from the Democratic Party on things like nuclear policy with Russia, Syria, Afghanistan.
Absolutely. And let me actually apologize for not bringing this important issue up earlier, because this actually, I think, is the most important issue of them all when it comes to Russiagate in terms of the existential consequences that it has had, where Democrats and the media in the US have been more interested in their deranged conspiracy theories about Trump and Russia and deranged paranoia about Russian interference to the point where they've been willing to ignore all of the major ways in which Trump and his crowd have dangerously escalated tensions with Russia, including literally threatening nuclear peril. So, you know, this whole time that we've been hearing about Trump as being Putin's puppet, meanwhile, he's done things like killing the INF Treaty, a major Cold War treaty with Russia reached under Reagan and Gorbachev that limited a whole class of missiles. He's very close to killing New START, the last remaining treaty that limits the nuclear weapon stockpiles of both countries. Thankfully, Biden won, and hopefully Biden will renew it. But all Trump had to do was under this treaty was simply say, yes, let's renew it. Russia was agreed to an automatic renewal. But the Trump and his cabinet are so hawkish that they and so bent on confronting China that they actually insisted on renegotiating New START and bringing China into it, which was an obvious non-starter because China's arsenal is nowhere near the levels of the U.S. and Russia. So they've increased the threat of nuclear peril. They've tried to overthrow Russia's key ally in Venezuela. Trump talked about pulling out of Syria for a bit, but then he was accused of giving Vladimir Putin a huge gift, including by Democrats who said he's doing Russia's bidding. So that helped, to the extent Trump was serious and was prepared to actually do anything about it, that helped kill that very quickly. So now we're still occupying Syria. So this Russiagate accusation, this allegation of him being a pawn of Putin, it didn't help just incentivize the media to ignore all the hawkish things Trump was doing towards Russia, but it also helped the media encourage Trump to be as hawkish as possible. Another example is under Obama. So he started basically this proxy war with Russia and Ukraine when Obama backed the Maidan coup in Ukraine, and that set off the war with Russian-backed separatists in the Donbass. And Obama, at a certain point, after presiding over this, with a key person being Victoria Nuland, who is coming back under Biden, Obama was under a lot of pressure to sell more weapons to Ukraine, and he ruled against it. And one of the few things he did, I think, that required some courage, and that I commend him for, because A, he didn't want to further inflame this proxy war, and B, he didn't want to arm neo-Nazis, which are a component of the Ukrainian armed forces. Trump comes into office. What does he do? He's being called a Putin puppet, in everyone's screaming about Russia. So he immediately reverses the Obama decision and sells those weapons to Ukraine. Of course, later on, when he briefly pauses those sales, he gets impeached. And the impeachment is all about how we have to fight Russia over there, so we don't have to fight them over here. And it's Jason Crow and Adam Schiff screaming every day about how Vladimir Putin wants to destroy our democracy. And a lot of people pretended as if this was a way of holding Trump to account and that this was really going to keep Trump in check, when really it was just another deranged Cold War exercise to, I think, make up for the failure of the Mueller investigation, which collapsed just a few months before impeachment. But anyway, so this has had catastrophic effects on foreign policy. It's meant that not only do we ignore Trump's real hawkish positions on Russia, and there's many more. There's also him trying to stop the construction of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline between Germany and Russia, which would integrate Russia further with Western Europe, a major priority for both countries. Trump imposed sanctions on people who were involved with that. But we just ignore that because it undermines the convenient narrative that Trump is doing Russia's bidding. It's insane. And again, taking it to the summer with the bounties allegation, where you know Russia gets accused of paying bounties to the Taliban. What happens then? Democrats join forces with Liz Cheney, and they pass an amendment in Congress to basically slow down or prevent Trump's withdrawals from Afghanistan. And the bounty thing was a major media moment for that. It was used to promote that, and everybody went along with it. So constantly, these Russiagate allegations were used to undermine diplomacy, ignore the fact that Trump was increasing the threat of nuclear peril, ignore Trump's coup attempt in Venezuela, which the media barely covered, and if they did, they supported it, and encourage him to be more hawkish. And it's worth asking, where was progressive media on this? I mean, again, I harp on this point, but Stephen F. Cohen, before his passing, was tirelessly warning about stuff like this, but there wasn't a big audience for it, even on the progressive side, because it conflicted with this convenient narrative about Trump doing Russia's bidding, and that became such a dominant way to oppose Trump. It's deranged. And there was one more thing I wanted to say. Oh yeah, and also meanwhile, because Trump was being opposed by the national security state, and because now our heroes were like John Brennan and Jim Comey, who were now filling our cable news airwaves, and these were treated as serious experts on cable news and the media. We had to worship the FBI and the CIA. That meant that whatever the imperatives of the national security state are then what we have to support as well, because these are the guys who are bravely standing up to Trump. So it had that impact as well, of like moving everyone to the right on policy, ignoring any policy that undermined the conspiracy theory about Trump and Russia, and then worshiping the national security state bureaucrats who, whenever Trump deviated from their orthodoxy, that's when they opposed him. And so that's why, when impeachment, the hero was this guy, Alexander Vindman, who spoke out because he didn't like the fact that Trump had paused weapon sales to Ukraine. He wanted to have a war in Ukraine. He wanted to arm Ukraine against Russia. And he was now our hero. And even on the liberal side, and there's, Joe Biden, I remember, gave a speech where he talked about, let's have a standing ovation for Alexander Vindman. I mean, neocons ended up being our heroes. And neocons, by the way, used this Russiagate thing and this Trump thing to rehabilitate themselves. And that's why all of a sudden David Frum was a liberal hero, and all the time on MSNBC, Bill Kristol. And everyone just watched it happen. And all these awful, hawkish neocon things became normalized because that was presented to us as the way to resist Trump.
That's right. You have people like Keith Olbermann apologizing publicly to his old nemesis, George W. Bush. I think that's one of the greatest consequences of Russiagate, is the rehabilitation of the neocons, the glorification of the national security state. It's extremely disturbing, and just how prominent it was. This Bountygate story was. They really ran with it. I mean, Joe Biden featured it in his convention speech.
Yep.
John Kerry did the same.
Yep.
Can you